You should have a chat box to the right side of your screen, so feel free to use it throughout this webinar to type in questions or complaints or just to share or to say anything you want, really. And we'll have a few surveys throughout the webinar, which will happen in the chat box. So for now, I'd just like to make sure that everyone can hear me. So if you can please type into chat, I hear you, then we'll be good to go momentarily. Hello, can you all hear me? All right, cool. So you've got a few yeses. I'm just going to wait another minute or two for people who are a few minutes late so they can join us. And after that, we will start. In the meantime, for those of you with us, how many of you have taken the GMAT before? And how many of you, for how many of you, is this your first time? All right, so we have a few who have not taken the GMAT yet. A few have taken it a few times. And again, this is meant to be somewhere between a lecture and an interactive webinar. So do take advantage of the chat box to ask questions and to participate. It'll make your own experience that much better. And for those of you who have taken it before or who have not, are there any specific things that you'd like to go over today that sort of are core to your requests for this webinar? All right. We are nearing a few minutes past the official start time. So I think that we're going to start. And again, welcome everyone. I'm glad you could join us today. If you cannot hear me, or if this audio is choppy or something like that, please let me know. This is meant to be somewhere between a lecture and an interactive webinar, so please use the chat box to write questions or comments and so on and so forth. Before we start with the core of the webinar, which is going to circle around the topic of cognitive flexibility, which is to say, which tools do you need to develop in order to break that 700 barrier? We're going to take a few minutes just to talk about who we are at examPAL, what our philosophy is. And this is important both for you to know who we are, and it's also important, especially for those of you who are not familiar with the GMAT, so that you know what the GMAT is all about. So what is this exam called the GMAT? And so we're just going to have a few minutes intro.
Hi everybody. My name is Oren Jackman and I'm the CEO and co-founder of examPAL. I've been in the field of test prep for the past 23 years. And before we dive into the webinar, I'd like to give you a brief introduction into what we at examPAL can do for you. If you've already signed up, you have full access to our video lessons, and you probably know that our team is there for you to answer any questions you may have. So what is examPAL? We started examPAL with the understanding that students all around the world pay too much and they do it for the wrong product. But they only realize that after they complete their preparation, when it's too late. What are they missing? Do you know this feeling when someone explains something to you and you just don't get it? We all do, right? Now, imagine what it's like to prepare for admissions tests such as GMAT, GRE, or SAT. The questions in these tests can have up to 10 different possible solution strategies, and all you need to do is find the fastest one. The thing is that students all around the world are bombarded with thousands of practice questions, tips, tricks, and shticks that are there to help everybody the same way. But there's no such thing as the explanation. I've personally taught over 5,000 students over the years, and when a novice teacher comes to me and asks, say, how do you explain this question? My answer is, to whom? That's examPAL in a nutshell. To whom? We don't just explain what makes the correct answer correct. We first ask ourselves, who are you? examPAL does three things no one else does. First, it studies the way you think. Second, it studies the effectiveness of all different possible solution strategies. Your goal is to be fast and correct. If there is a faster way, we'll find it. And third, using this information, we find the best way to solve each question. The best for you. Not even private tutors do this. We're with you in each and every question, from basics to the hardest ones. When we offer you a solution strategy, we don't just guess it works. We measure everything. So, just to summarize the pain, test takers spend a lot of time and money preparing for admissions tests only to realize that courses, the brick and mortar classroom courses, are frustrating. There can be 10 different ways to solve each question. How can I find which way is best for me? Ineffective. Your biggest enemy is time. How can one-size-fits-all course tell you which way is the most effective for you to save time? And time-consuming. You're wasting too much time on thousands of questions and tips that are irrelevant to you. Shouldn't you focus only on what you need? Now, there's a far greater revolution happening here, and that's in the understanding of what preparing for these exams really means. These tests are unlike the tests you had in high school. Mastering admissions tests is not about knowledge. These tests measure a skill called cognitive flexibility, which is your ability to change your set of tools very quickly according to the changes in the data that you're getting. This is why the test has harsh time constraints, and we keep moving from algebra to geometry to word problems very quickly. So, examPAL doesn't just provide you with the knowledge you need for the test, we train you to find the fastest way to solve each question. How do we do that? Our process starts with interactive video lessons. While you study our course studies you, and it's fun. Each topic starts with a short video teaser, usually a funny one, that will make you wait for the next lesson. As one of our students put it, I'm becoming addicted. So we start off with an introduction that gives you all the basic tools you need, whether it is formulas or the logic behind a new concept, and we move from there to the lesson, in which we demonstrate how different questions from the test can be solved using different approaches. Next, our special source, practice. Each practice session starts with a diagnostic phase. We found out that even when there are 10 ways to solve a question, they can all be divided into 3 strategies: precise, alternative, or logical. This is the PAL behind the name examPAL. In the diagnostic phase, we analyze how well you are using each strategy. This question, for example, can be solved logically by figuring out the ratio between the numerator and the denominator, precisely by simplifying the algebraic expression, or alternatively by using simple numbers. Only one answer can be correct, right? So in diagnostic phase, we quickly learn what your level is in implementing each of these tools. Then comes the improvement phase, in which we focus on your level and find the best questions for you to solve in order to improve your skills. That's not just being adaptive like the test is. Simply giving you easier or harder questions won't do the trick. We find out exactly which tools work best for you and what were the reasons for your mistakes. And then comes the best part. In the optimization phase, both practice questions and solution strategies are chosen to match your own personal needs. In this example, the system found 4 solution strategies ranked in order of relevance to you. In professional terms, this is an open semi-supervised recommendation system. In other words, this is moving from machine learning to machine teaching, from deep learning to deep teaching, scanning through the ideas of others in order to find the one that is easiest for you to understand and implement. Just to give you a broader understanding of what makes examPAL so special, we're the first company to utilize artificial intelligence in a new innovative approach. Artificial intelligence can be described as moving from machines that replace humans to machines that behave like humans. Well, we're in a mission to create a tool that behaves better than humans. If we want an online service to be able to teach, it must have the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of real people. It is our over 50,000 students from 156 countries who help us teach you. Our students teach us how to teach them. And it works. The effect is amazing. Research shows that an average student using examPAL reaches the highest possible level within segments of just 30 questions per topic. These are some of the global awards that we won over time for education, innovation, and AI. And students love it. examPAL has blown my mind. It helped me improve by 180 points, etc. And last, but certainly not least, we give you a real success guarantee. 70 points in the GMAT, up to 7 points in the GRE. And I'm using the term real because we're not one of these places where improvement is measured relatively to a mock test you've done when you had no clue about anything. If you have a previous score that you're not satisfied with, an official score, we guarantee that you are going to improve it significantly. So, just to give you a quick look at some of the benefits you get with examPAL, first of all, one approach to rule them all, that's the PAL approach. Video lessons that cover everything from the basics to the hardest questions. Personalized practice using our innovative system. Tutor support around the clock. We're there 7 days a week in surprising hours. Try us. Real official GMAT mocks as part of the course, plus you get GMAT Club tests if you need more practice. Essay reviews by professional raters, a big difference for non-native English speakers. You are not just measured on the verbal section. Admissions consultancy, 60 minutes free admissions consultancy comes with any of our packages. And of course, an engaging experience that will keep you studying for hours. So now for today's webinar, and we're looking forward to having you on board. Thanks.
All right. So after that short intro, which I hope gives you a little bit of insight into why the GMAT is a different type of test from what you've likely done in college or in school before, we're going to dive in. And the majority of this webinar is going to be devoted into the cognitive flexibility, which Owen mentioned during his introduction. And this is basically about how to break into the 700 Club. So a few of you mentioned before the webinar began that you have taken the exam before, several times in fact, and you just can't seem to break through that 700 barrier. And that's what we're going to focus on today, which is to say, what are the skills that are required to get into these very, very high percentiles? And essentially, there are two main categories of skills that we're going to talk about today. The first one is what we call cognitive flexibility. And you can think of this as the toolbox. So you're walking into the GMAT exam, and you have your toolbox of tools, of problem-solving tools that you bring with you from your course or from home or from wherever you like. And the real key to success on the exam is how you utilize these tools, which is to say, how you can recognize very, very quickly when looking at a question which tool you should use in order to solve this question. So this is going to be the first part of the webinar. And the second part of the webinar is the rapid improvement. And this is especially relevant for those of you who have taken the GMAT before. and who would like to improve their score. And the reason is that many students we find reach a plateau phase. So you've done your studying, you know the material, you know more or less how to solve a question, and you run into issues of timing. You just can't solve the questions quickly enough. You run into issues of making silly mistakes. You don't notice the traps properly, or you miss the small details, and these really hurt your score. So this is going to be the second part of the webinar. And after that, we're going to talk about a specific schedule, which is to say how you can take these slightly abstract concepts and turn them into an actual, day-by-day plan. So, what is cognitive flexibility? And as I mentioned, it is essentially how you can use your GMAT solving toolbox. It is the ability to quickly find the fastest way to solve each question and to apply it. And we've sort of labeled these set of tools as the PALgorithm, which is the PAL in examPAL. And this is essentially dividing all the different types of tools into three broad categories. And the first one of these categories is a precise tool. And this, I think, is what most people think of when they first imagine solving a question. So when you're first, and we're going to see a few examples of this later on, but when you're first looking at a question, then what you naturally usually want to do is to translate that question into equations, and then to try to apply various calculations, addition, subtraction, isolating variables, multiplying, and so on and so forth, in order to sort of simplify your equations until you get to the right answer. So basically, precise method is putting all of your various data into the right equations in the right order and just solving it. And this works, and this is really important to mention. Precise methods always work because every single one of the questions given to you on the GMAT is actually solvable. This isn't like a research question which you don't know if there is an answer to or not. But it can take a long time, and this is where the other types of tools come into play. So the first set of tools we label as alternative, and these are tools that can get us to the right answer even if we're not sure why that answer is correct. And so the classic tool is basically eliminating answers. So if you look at your question and your question asks you about, say, the weighted average between, say, two mixtures. So you have, I don't know, a 3% alcohol solution and 10% alcohol solution. And you're given some sort of average. You don't know exactly how much of each solution is in the middle. And you can just sort of look at the range. So you can say, well, I mean, I know that my average is going to be somewhere in the middle between these two. And so I can look at my answers and I can eliminate all the answers that are not within this range. And this is a rather artificial example, but there are plenty of examples where you could just eliminate answers. And once you've eliminated all the answers except for one, you know that that must be the right answer, even if you're not sure why it is. And so these types of tools, and it's not just eliminating answers, it's a whole category of tools, are geared to get you to the right answer even without knowing the explicit process to get there. The third broad category we call logical, and these are tools which you'll often see in number property related questions, for example. So for example, things to do with even and odd, things to do with divisibility, these types of things that can allow you to get to the right answer without actually performing any of the calculations. So in comparison, in a precise method, you might want to translate, say, a ratio into exact numbers. So into, say, a ratio of 2 to 3. So you'd write that in x's and y's, and then you'd sort of transfer things from one side of the equation to the other, and you'd solve it. And with logical approaches, you wouldn't even need to do this. You would just expand or reduce it, and that would get you to the right answer. And I sort of want to give a few examples because sort of this has been a little bit abstract so far, and we're going to get to a few examples soon on. Before we do, I would like to, well, mention again, I suppose, that it's not only about how many tools you have in your toolbox, it's also about when you want to use them. And this is really where the self-learning part of the GMAT comes into play. And again, to contrast with sort of a regular college class where you're maybe sitting and you're hearing a lecture tell you exactly what you need to do and why, then on the GMAT, most of your preparation is going to be self-study. So I can, as a tutor, I can give you the tools, I can teach you which tools to use, but at the end of the day, you're going to need to develop the ability within yourself to look at a question and to recognize which tool you should be using for that question. You're going to need to develop the ability to look within yourself also, and to say, I'm good at using these types of methods, I'm bad at using these types of methods. I tend to make mistakes on these types of questions and so on and so forth. And this sort of decision-making process, this metacognition, is really, really what we find separates students who do manage to get into that 700 club to break the 700 barrier and those that don't. And so let's move on. And the questions we're going to show are official GMAT questions. So they're actually official questions from the exam. And so they may look easy, and they are relatively simple, but they are official questions. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to sort of flash the question on the screen really, really quickly, just for say 20 seconds or so, not for too long. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to practice using the tools that we've mentioned so far. So I want you to practice your decision-making process. I want you to read the question. I want you to think to yourself, how would I like to solve this question? Would I prefer solving it by precise approach, which is to say, translate it into equations, go through the equations one after another, and then reach an exact answer? Do I think there's some sort of, let's say, elimination process or trick that I can use to find out the right answer without actually going through the entire equation process? Or do I think there's maybe some kind of underlying logic to the question which can help me get to the right answer without explicitly calculating, just via logic? So again, I'm going to flash the question on the screen for, say, 20 to 30 seconds. I'd like you to make a judgment. Type into chat which of the methods you think is best, and we'll take it from there. So here's the question. Okay, time. So what do you think? How would you approach this question? Would you go a precise method, which is to say, would you translate it into equations? Do you think there's some sort of trick which can allow you to get to the right answer without even bothering with equations? Or do you think there's some kind of underlying logic or symmetry to it? So we're seeing a few precise answers, which is usually what happens. And here we're even seeing someone who's explicitly writing the specific equations that need to be solved. And okay, so cool. So that's what we're going to start off with. We're going to start off with a precise approach to this question. And again, what's important to remember about the GMAT is that the precise method always works. These questions are always solvable. So let's go through the question. The number of rooms at Hotel G is 10 less than twice the number of rooms at Hotel H. If the total number of rooms at Hotel G and Hotel H is 25, what is the number of rooms at Hotel G? And we can, as mentioned in chat, just translate this into equations. So if G is 10 less than twice H, we can write that as G equals 2H minus 10. We can then do a bunch of relatively simple algebra. So we substitute 2H minus 10 instead of G, then we have H plus 2H minus 10 is 425. 3H equals 435, H is 145. Substitute that back, and you get that G equals 280. Answer choice E. And this works, and it is a very, very simple question. Again, it's an official question. I'm not making this question up. And from our statistics, it takes not too long. It takes about a minute and a half. For some people, you might think this is a long time. But often, what takes time is realizing which equations to write and then going through them. And especially if you have something like 3H equals 435, some people get stuck with just dividing. Just the simple multiplying and dividing can take you time if you're not very, very good at it. And what I want to showcase now is a different method. So this is an alternative approach. It's again, and the meta concept that I want you to keep in mind is that we're looking at different types of tools with which to solve the question. And I'm not saying that one tool is necessarily better than the other, but I am suggesting that you sort of broaden your view. So you look at all the different types of methods of tools with which to solve a given question, and then you make up your own mind on which tools you like to use and which you don't. So in this case, the alternative approach would say, well, maybe I'm not entirely sure how to translate this world problem into an equation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and look at my answers. And I'm going to start off with C. And if C is right, so if there's about 200 rooms at Hotel G, then since H is about half of that, that means that there's going to be about 100 rooms in Hotel H, meaning that together, G and H are going to have about 300 rooms together, and that's way too small. So we need 425 rooms. So it definitely can't be C. And so we can eliminate C, and we can also eliminate B and A because they're even smaller. And so what we can do next is we can look at D. And we can say, oh, okay, so let's say D was right. And then that means that there's about 240 rooms in Hotel G, about half that in H. So H is about 120, that's 360 rooms. That also can't be right. And even before checking E, we can say, well, E is the only possible answer that's left, and therefore it must be right. And so again, I want to zoom out for a moment because the question itself is very, very simple. The meta point here is that we didn't actually solve the question. So I didn't translate it into equations like before. So we didn't go through this entire process. And sometimes this process can be very, very long. Instead, we just looked at the answers. We substituted them back into the equation, and we eliminated the answers that are impossible. And eventually, we got to the one answer that makes sense. And even if we don't know exactly why this is the right answer, we know that it must be the right answer. And this is the key point behind the alternative method. And at times, and in this specific case, it can be much, much shorter. So again, this isn't necessarily an indicative question, but looking at questions on our website, then using the answers and plugging them back into the equation is often a much, much faster way than going through a sequence of complex calculations. And this is what I want you to keep in mind when you're thinking of the different types of ways that question can be approached. So the second question is going to focus on a slightly different class of solutions, and this is the logical class that I mentioned before. And so we're just going to go through this one together. And so the question is like this. On a 3-day fishing trip, 4 adults consumed food costing $60. For the same food cost per person per day, what would be the cost of food consumed by 7 adults during a 5-day fishing trip? And again, the question is relatively simple. I'm sure that some of you are onto the solution right away. But the main point behind this is that we don't actually have to translate this question into equations to solve it. We can just use the logical property of ratios that they can be extended and reduced. So a ratio, for example, of 3 days to $60 is the same as a ratio of 1 day to $20. And then the ratio of a 1-day trip for 4 adults for $20 is the same as a ratio of a 1-day trip for 1 adult for $5. And all I really did here is I expanded and I reduced the ratios to get to a number that's more easy to calculate with. And then I can take this ratio of 1 to 1 to 5, and I can multiply it by 7 adults and by 5 days. And I can get to the answer of 175. And so here again, the question is simple, but the concept is really important. And again, you can go on our website and you can see actual questions, more and more intense questions, or you can go on the YouTube channel. We have a few other webinars with more relevant questions in terms of difficulty. But zooming out again to the meta, you don't actually have to translate a question into equations in order to solve it. If you recognize an underlying logical property of whatever concept the question is talking about, in this case it's ratios, then you can use that property to get to the right answer without going through the process of equations. And this is the third broad category of tools that we teach. It's what are these logical properties that can enable you to get to the right answer without actually plugging it into equations itself. Cool. So those were a few, and again, there's the time issue, and there's only the example here of this specific question. And you can really see, and again, I recommend you check out the timing webinar on YouTube if you're more interested in specific applications of time. But you can really see a difference between different types of tools, which is to say different types of tools take less time than others. So the next question that I want to look at is more from verbal than from quant. So the first 2 questions that we looked at are quant questions. And again, this question is an official GMAT question, so I'm not making this question up. And the most important thing to realize about verbal questions, and especially critical reasoning and reading comprehension, and especially if any of you are non-native speakers, is that most people waste an enormous amount of time on the verbal exam just by doing things inefficiently. And what I mean is by doing things inefficiently is that they go through every single one of the answers, they read them, they think about them, and then they convince themselves, or they get convinced, or they get confused because the answer choices are often very similar to each other. There's often, we're going to see this in the next question, there's often only minor details that separate the right answer choices from the wrong answer choices. Sometimes in reading comprehension, this is a minor detail. In the text and the critical reasoning, it could be a question of scope or a question of how extreme the answer choice is. But these are things that should be avoided by not going to the answer choices first, even though it can be tempting to do so. And so let's look at this question together. This is a critical reasoning question. And for those of you not familiar with the critical reasoning format, essentially you're given a short logical passage, such as this one. And then you're asked a question about the assumptions in that passage, or about how to strengthen the argument in the passage, or how to weaken the argument, and so on and so forth. And then you're given a bunch of answer choices, which are all more or less about the topic of the passage. And what you need to do is you need to identify which of the answer choices best answers the question. And what we recommend, and not just us, but everyone who teaches these types of questions on the GMAT, is not to go directly to the answer choices. So in these types of questions, what you want to do is you first want to analyze the passage. You want to break it down into its logical components. And using those components, you want to infer the right answer. So let's do that for a moment here. So this question goes like this. The interview is an essential part of a successful hiring program because with it, job applicants who have personalities that are unsuited to the requirements of the job will be eliminated from consideration. Now, if we take that passage and we break it down into its bare bones, then what we're going to see is that the main part of the passage says that an interview is essential because it can eliminate people who have unsuitable personalities. So that's the logical structure of this passage. Part one is an interview is an essential. Part two is because it can eliminate people with unsuitable personalities. And so if you like, you can draw that as an arrow diagram, sort of as written above, or you can sort of bullet point this however you like. And then what you would like to do, what you should do, is you should read the statement, the question stem, which asks you this argument depends on which of the following assumptions. And you should reach a point in your practice, if you can't do it now, where you can look at the passage, you can answer the question without actually reading the answer choices. And sort of that's what we want to do here. So we're saying if an interview is essential because it can eliminate people with wrong personalities, then the natural assumption behind this is that the interview can actually do that, which is to say the interview can actually identify the people who have these unsuitable personalities. And sort of looking at our answer choices, this is exactly what answer choice C tells us. And sort of this is the moment to pause and sort of say that on the GMAT, an assumption is always a statement that is not explicitly stated within the passage. And it's a statement that must be true for the argument to hold. So in this case, if the statement C were false, if interviews could not accurately identify applicants with improper personalities, then the entire argument would fall through because then the interview would not be an essential part of a successful hiring program. And the reason why it's important in these types of questions, and this, by the way, is what we call the precise approach for these specific types of questions, which is we've broken down the passage into its logical bare bones, we've inferred an answer, and only then we've gone to look for that answer within the answer choices. And so if we look at the other answer choices, then we can see that all of them talk about hiring, about interviews, about successful programs. And so if we were to read them without actually understanding what the logic behind the passage was, we would probably get confused. And specifically, we can, for example, look at D. And what's wrong with D? So what's wrong with D is that it says the only purpose of an interview is to evaluate whether job applicants' personalities are suited. And only is a little bit too extreme. It's a little bit harsh. We can look at E, and E looks like it fits. It says the fit of a job applicant's personalities was once the most important factor in making hiring decisions, and this makes sense, but it has the problem that it talks about stuff that happened a while back. It doesn't directly address the interview itself, which is the core part of the argument. And similarly, you can eliminate answers A and B, which are also close but are slightly out of scope, or there's something small that's wrong with them. And this something small that's wrong with them is often confusing to recognize, especially in the more complex critical reasoning passages if you haven't taken the time to break them down beforehand. Okay, so these are sort of the three broad categories of skills that we teach in order to approach the different GMAT questions. And again, I mean, like each of these, of course, has there are many different precise ways. There are many different ways to translate things into equations. There are many different tools that can get you to the right answer without knowing why, and there are many different logical properties to know. But these are the three broad categories that we divide tools into. And again, I want to take a step back and I want to move the ball back to your side of the court. So I, as a tutor, can teach you these various tools, but the person who needs to do the homework, who needs to learn to recognize when to use which tool, that is you. That is on you. And that is the self-study part of the program. And that is also what our algorithm does when it adapts the specific tools that we find that you use the most and you use the most efficiently. Cool. So that was cognitive flexibility. The second part of which is, and just to sort of summarize that, the cognitive flexibility, the toolbox. So, building up your toolbox of tools. The second part, and especially for those of you who are test retakers, is about rapid improvement. So it's about that wall. It's about that phase when you've studied all the material, you know all the tools, you know all the tricks, and you just can't break a certain barrier. And often this is a barrier of time. So you just don't have enough time to solve things properly, which is to say you have to rush through things and then you make silly mistakes. Or it's a barrier of just focus and attention and details. And these two are related. So of course, if you have more time, you can put more attention. But the two are related. And often what we find is that people try to solve these types of problems by doing more of the same, which is to say by practicing more, by practicing for longer hours. And this is usually the wrong way to go about it. So often, if you're at that plateau, if you're at that glass wall, then what you need to do is not more of the same. If you just do more of the same, you'll get the same result. What you need to do is you need to change up your strategy. And changing up your strategy really, really involves looking at your mistakes. And one of the most important things that you'll need to do as you study for the GMAT is to build up an error log. So this is sort of, a very, very pedantic type of, say, Excel sheet or Google sheet or whatever you prefer, where you write down which questions you got wrong and you write down why you got them wrong. And you need to view every time you get a question wrong, and even the question that you get right, as opportunities to learn more. And we like to have mistakes into three broad categories. The first type of category is professional. And by professional mistake, I mean a mistake that shows that you actually didn't know the material, even though maybe you thought you did. So there was a specific maybe geometric rule or rule about factorizations or maybe complex rule and probability that you just did not know and you need to go back and study that. A technical mistake is what I like to call a silly mistake. So this is something along the lines of a simplification error. Or you forgot about a zero when you were testing numbers in something, or you forgot about negative powers, or so on and so forth. These are mistakes that often are solved by more careful work, which is either by using your sketchpad or by going over the list of possible traps and making sure that you know them and know what to look out for, or by verifying that your calculations are correct just for a few seconds before you hit that next button, so on and so forth. And the third type of error is strategic, and this is often related to timing. So this is the ability, and especially for those of you who are aiming really high but are currently not at the 700 level, so you're at the, say, the 600 level, then you're not at the stage where you can solve all of the questions on the GMAT. And you shouldn't try to either. So trying to power through and solve every single question on the GMAT is often the wrong way to go. Often a much, much more beneficial way to go is to sort of develop a good guessing strategy, which is to say, I'm going to answer 4 out of 5 questions on the exam, or I'm only going to answer 3 out of 4 questions on the exam. I'm not even going to attempt the other one. And what this does is it increases the average time per question by 25%, or by however many questions you decided to skip. It also spreads out your guesses. So what we've shown in simulations on the mock tests and so on and so forth is that if you clump all of your guesses together, then this hurts your score much, much more than if you spread your guesses out along the test. And so these types of decisions, again, going back to the metacognition, to your decision-making process, these are strategic decisions. These are decisions of when should I skip a question. These are decisions of, am I stuck in a loop? Am I sort of trying to do the same thing and am I missing something? In general, am I missing something when I'm looking at a question? And this is something that you really need to develop. And this is a really, really important part of improving, of breaking that glass ceiling that you just can't get through. And once you have that, then you can put additional practice into play. So once you know where your mistakes are, you've focused on a specific section, you've focused on a specific technical area, you've focused on a specific strategic mistake, then you can practice on that specific mistake. You can improve that specific area, and that is where the rapid improvement comes from. And then, of course, you need to seek out to tackle similar questions, which is to say, don't just write things down in your Google Sheet, actively try to improve these issues. And this is just a few examples of how things look on the website. So this is an example of a question below which we give one suggested tool with which you can solve a question, and we give specific notes, and there are for each question sort of several slides like this where you can see different types of approaches. And going back to the intro at the start, then the heart of our learning program is essentially your feedback. So while you solve a question, if you get the question right, you're right. You press which of the tools you use to get the question right. If you got it wrong, you also explain why. And this is what allows us to adapt the questions and answers that you see to your specific needs. And honestly, it also just allows you to focus. So the feedback time, even if you don't end up using this platform, but the time that you take to feedback, so after you solve a question, that sort of 10 to 20 seconds that you stop and you think to yourself, what did I miss here? That is super critical. That is something that you should never, ever skip. And you can do it in 5 to 10 question chunks. You don't have to do it after every single question, but you should definitely have a debugging session after every practice phase that you do. Cool. So what we've gone over so far is the tools, sort of this tool set. And again, these aren't specific, I'm not going to teach you today how to, solve or use the logic of even and odd numbers, or how to solve divisibility questions or geometry questions. But I am trying to give you the grand scheme of things, which is to say the main tools that you will need to develop in order to ace the GMAT. And the first of these was what we call cognitive flexibility. So this is the toolbox. This is having a large set of tools with which to approach each question, and the ability to choose which of the tools is best for you. And the second broad category is rapid improvement, which is to say to really, really take the time to learn from your mistakes. And this is true whether you're a retaker or whether you're a first timer. And we'll get to that later, but it's especially true for the practice exams. And so the last part of this webinar is, except for any Q&A that you might have, is how to translate all of what I've been talking about so far into action. So how do you develop this into a study plan? And we recommend only a month to a month and a half, up to 2 months actually, of study time. And the reason for this, and not for non-native English speakers, but especially if you're a native English speaker, then we find that once you delve into the material, after a certain amount of time passes, you tend to forget it. So if you spread out, and I'm not talking about someone who's retaking and they started half a year ago and they're still studying today, which I hope none of you are in that situation for too long. But I'm talking about if from one exam to the next exam, or right before the first exam, you don't want to spend 3 months or 4 months practicing, because then you'll just forget what you've studied. You want to condense it. You want to have relatively intense weeks, medium intensity weeks, which is to say somewhere around the 20 hours, 15 to 20 hours per week. And this is what will enable you, how much would it be on it from an exam? I'll get to the Q&A in a second, but please do type questions into chat. So you do want to have 15 to 20 hour weeks. This is what we recommend. And this covers everything. So here we've divided it into how much time you want to spend into just learning the material, how much time you want to spend learning the strategies, the lessons, how much time you want to practice and learn the PALgorithm, and then how much time you want to review various materials. And what is important to add here is that if you're a non-native English speaker, if your English requires a lot of work, then we usually recommend that you take an extra month before this. And so before sort of starting to prepare for the GMAT, it would be really, really beneficial to just spend a month working on your English skills, which is to say your GMAT specific English skills. So this is reading academic type articles. This is maybe practicing your writing skills for the essay. This is working on basic grammar and so on. And on our website, we have sort of lists of suggested reading materials and so on and so forth that can sort of really focus you in on that. And specifically, if you go day by day, then we have a very, very organized and simple to use course trail. You basically have to follow it. will take you through everything that you need to learn. And so the first month and a half or so, up to 50 days, you just follow the trail. You can spend a day learning the basics and then another day practicing learning the different strategies. Excuse me, you should be spending an hour or so, even more if possible, every day reading, again, high quality reading material. And this is really what's going to help you with the reading comprehension sections on the verbal, for example, and also with the essay, with the writing. And once you've done that, you want to review the material. And sort of this is where I want to pause and say, go back to the rapid improvement that we talked about. So the practice cats. People sometimes use the practice exams, the practice cats, the official cats by the GMAT, to sort of gauge where they are. So you know you're taking a practice exam and you want to know if you're around a 600 or a 650 or a 700, or maybe if you're really bad, you're at a 500 or 550. And this is a really important thing to do when you're using the practice exam, but it's missing. It's missing the most important part of your practice exams, which is you need to review them. So the practice exam is where everything comes together. It's where you combine all the strategies you've learned along with all of your tools that you've gained. And it's where you are able to feedback yourself on, is my strategy working? Which types of sections are not working well or not? And when you take a practice exam, you should take an entire exam. So you should set 3 to 4 hours aside, preferably at the same time of day as you'll take the real exam, and really treat this as a real life simulation. And that also tests your, for example, focus abilities. So are you able to focus for 2 hours at a time or for 3 hours at a time with the 8-minute breaks in there, which is what you'll need to do on the real exam or not. So this is really, really important to emphasize with respect to the cats. And review your mistakes, go over the error log. Solve fast, skip slowly, I think has been sort of the theme of this webinar, but I haven't explicitly said it, which is to say learn from your mistakes. And once you're done with all that, then take a day off on the day before the exam. On day 60, after all of that work, you're going to be super ready and super prepared, and you can just go and crush that GMAT. And that is what you should do. And so we're going to be transitioning over into the questions and answer section brief momentarily. I'd sort of like to summarize what we've gone over today because there's been quite a lot. So the first two parts here are the meta strategies that you'll need to develop in order to get to your maximal possible score, whether this is the 700 club or whether it's a different score. So number one is cognitive flexibility, which is to build up the toolbox of tools that you'll need and to learn when to use those tools. Number two is rapid improvement, which is learning from your mistakes. It's really taking the time to feedback yourself. And number three is how you organize that into a day. So I recommend medium intensity weeks, which is to say 15 to 20 hours per week, over a month and a half to 2 months, not more than that, and preferably not less than that. Great. So as you all know, Black Friday is coming up. There's a crazy 40% discount. This comes around once a year. We don't do this at other times. So we'll be sending out an email also with the webinar summary, but you can just go to the website and you can check out the Black Friday sale. You can also just set up a free account. I would recommend you do so if any of what I've said here today sounds appealing to you, and just sort of see what we're about. Don't take my word for it. Check it out for yourself. Cool. So let me go through the questions for a moment in the Q&A.